So the last time, good afternoon, everybody. The last time we were all together, we started reading up on the juvenile offender. We got started in the beginning of that chapter. I sincerely hope that you all have gotten into it a little bit more. As always, we want to start by reviewing the things that we should have a good working understanding of by the end of this chapter. As always, we see concepts from the italics. Study that closely and prepare for the exam or our second pop quiz, which will be coming up any day now. So please stay ready for that. We don't have very much more to go, so we're going to talk about this chapter for a few days now. So if you're a little bit behind, definitely try and get caught up. And really focus again on some of the components of this chapter because there's been some things done in the realm of juvenile justice that as young criminal justice professionals, I surely hope that you all don't reproduce. But take in this first, what you should know at the end of this chapter, and we'll just start to discuss these in more detail in a moment. So we started off, as you know, each chapter does, giving you some anecdote that, by and large, you will not be tested on directly, but just give you some background information about this topic and why, it's an important area of focus within the corrections system. And we see that when we talk about juvenile corrections, they've not always done an effective job of really keeping juvenile offenders protected. As we talked about in the chapter on prisoners' rights, the guards, they have a important and delegate responsibility in terms of keeping these institutions safe and making sure that they can do their jobs effectively in an orderly manner. But the inmates still have rights as well. Now, as we'll talk about it, and we read together as a group last week, they don't have the same level of constitutional rights as adult offenders do. They also don't have the same sentencing criteria that adults have. So that's the justification that we don't sentence them as harshly. They aren't going to a court of law per se. So they don't have all those constitutional rights that you do get as an adult. But they do still have some rights, and obviously a right from sexual abuse is a pretty fundamental one. But at this West Texas Center, there was quite a bit of this going on over several years. I mean, just think about it, over 4,000 reports of abuse. And these are just, the ones that people had the energy and the gumption to actually report. This will probably suggest, excuse me, this would probably suggest that there were probably more cases than this, much like our statistics on rape are instructive, but they're vastly underreported because so many, rape victims end up not reporting the cases. Keep in mind, I said rape victims, not female victims, because men get raped too. And a lot of dudes ain't going to report that, and many women don't report theirs as well. So take this 4,000 number as high and robust as it is with a grain of salt, and it is probably what's even more dangerous than that for juveniles. I would imagine by this point, you all have probably seen some of the researches I have that shows the links between being institutionalized as a juvenile and later incarceration as an adult. So ideally, and we'll talk about this in much more detail in a moment, ideally, we want them to be reformed at this age. We want them to go into the system and, we've all, I won't say we've all, I know I definitely made some mistakes as a juvenile. We don't necessarily want these to ruin your whole entire life. We got to keep the public safe from you, even if you are a juvenile, but we want to do so in an environment where we can actually rehabilitate you and reform you before it gets too late. It is difficult to imagine that that's happening in this West Texas Center when you see all these levels of abuse. And it speaks again to the workforce as well. That's why it's really important that you all pay attention to these things, because again, you all are going to be responsible for working, with individuals within the criminal justice system. And if they do wrong, they should be punished for that. But we don't need to mistreat people to get justice in this country. If, again, we need to, institutionalize some of these juveniles because they've been such a threat, that's understandable. If we need to, contain George Floyd because, we feel like he's broken the law, that's reasonable. But some of the abuse in cases that we, get are not understandable or reasonable at all. It would be a great disappointment to me if, you all did not go into your fields and try and clean some of this stuff up. Great question, Nigeria. Great question. So Nigeria's question in the chat is like, how are we getting these officers hired and they don't do things like background checks? So in many of the cases, the individuals may not have a history that would suggest this kind of abuse. But to your point, there are steps being taken to try and screen people, for some of my students who may have or want to go into mental health, for example, one of your functions oftentimes will be doing some psychological screenings in Nigeria. So they can do those kind of things. So in this way, for example, like with police officers, we can't necessarily predict who is a racist and who ain't. A lot of times there's a lot going on in the subconscious, but there are things that we can expose people to suggest how they might behave in a given situation in Nigeria. So we can do things to screen that. And one of the things, quite frankly, that they're doing is they're requiring more education of people going into these positions. A lot of times, and let me be clear, and I got you 1 second, Savannah. This don't mean that college educated people can't make these kind of barbaric mistakes. They can, and they do. But in your case, Nigeria, you've been exposed to this kind of information and other information about human development a lot more broadly. And the hope would be that you all would be able to take that into your professions. But that's a great question. And again, your education is going to give you a leg up when you go into the job market and you're competing with other people that may not have as much formalized education in you. That's going to give you a great advantage. So I really, hope you all, not only take this seriously, but also understand, Nigeria, that in going into a discipline like criminal justice, you're going to have to keep learning the rest of your life. Because things are always going to be changes. You're going to need to make sure that you stay up with the curve. Savannah, you've been very patient.
I just want to kind of piggyback off that. My cousin, he's a correction officer. And yes, they do background checks, but they also do evaluations. And me personally, of hearing conversations from him, I think they should be more hard on their evaluation, not just with the other co-workers, but with the juveniles, inmates who are in the system, to really break down, who's really there to make a change and who's there just to get a paycheck and just be evil.
That's an excellent point as well. Once we get them in there, how do we evaluate how they're performing and what they're doing? And I think you make some sound points there, Savannah, that if they're only being evaluated by their fellow co-workers, much like with the police, where, you all have heard of the blue line, where when somebody, messes up, oftentimes they kind of rally together. And that's true in a lot of different professions, like, quite frankly, but that may require, Savannah, like the need to have some kind of external evaluation system. So yeah, all these are great ideas. And look, when we're talking about these things, these ain't things that are just abstract. You all, Savannah, are going to be in position soon where you are going to be, again, with your talents and your hard work, you're going to move up the line in your different careers. So you're going to be at a point one day where you're going to have the ability to make decisions, influence and whole departments and units and things like that. I have no doubt of that. And I hope that you'll look at these things and do some of that out of the box thinking that you all have done here and introduce that into your disciplines and fields, because a lot of it, Savannah, that we just keep doing the same thing over and over again because that's all we've been doing. And we need younger bloods like yourself to kind of infuse this industry with some new ways of thinking. We need, again, not only in terms of more age representation, we need more minorities in these disciplines. We need more women that will bring different perspectives than we've had so far. And most importantly, we'll actually fix these problems. Again, if it's something like little juvenile, and I've had this, like, again, in my family, my nephew, unfortunately, he's institutionalized now as an adult. He was institutionalized several times as a juvenile. He needed to be. Like, he was, and I love him to death. He's named after me, actually. But yeah, Lil Rashid, that's my middle name. He's a menace to society. But he's a good kid. Like, he's not a bad person. So ideally, he would be exposed to things that kind of bring out some of the goodness in him while he's still young, before some of those bad habits get crystallized. Because if, again, we're sending these kids, and it could be, again, my nephew, it could be your nephew, it could be your little cousin, it could be your child one day. You never know. So we want to make sure that they're getting in places where, they're not going to be more likely to reproduce their bad behavior. And sexual assault, it's just inexcusable, quite frankly. Like, these are kids. So you had 2.5% again at this center involving youth. And I'm not going to test you on the data, just give you some context of some of the mess up things that are going on. We're going to get into the testable things in a moment. Nearly 8% of the juveniles in this center reported an incident involving facility staff. 3.5% reported having sex with a facility staff. Again, take it out, like, imagine like this is a high school and you got these kind of numbers with juveniles. Like, it's just crazy. Approximately 92% of them all reported sexual misconduct and said they had been victimized by female staff. So again, a lot of times, historically it's been believed that some of these behaviors were just, related to men and our testosterone levels and our socialized violence, and those things play a role. But make no mistake, that women can behave as nasty as we have in these positions. And again, a lot of it is not about gender or race. It's just about power relationships. Has anybody heard of the Stanford Prison Experiment? Anybody heard of the Stanford Prison Experiment before? You probably have, even if you don't know it offhand. Very quickly, I'm sorry, Savannah, do you want to chime in?
Oh, I heard Dr. Rose kind of mention it in a few times in my class last semester, but she really didn't get into depths about it.
Absolutely. I would encourage you, if you have time, to do a brief Google or YouTube search on it. It won't take you very long, but like they have like the actual experiment recorded. A couple of years ago, Savannah, they actually did like a full-length movie about it. So the Stanford experiment was at Stanford University. This is in the 1970s. And very quickly, Latasia, like they simulated a prison. They simulated a prison. So it's a professor, I want to say this is Professor Lombardo. He split his class up, and he had one group of students, Savannah, they were the prisoners, and the other group of students, they were the prison guards. And very, very quickly, Nigeria, things got buck wild. Like within 3 days, he had to shut the whole project down. Because those students, and again, these are people that was all cool and collaborating with each other before, but the professor gave them some power over their classmates, and they got ruthless. They was like doing like really messed up stuff to people. in just like a couple of days. So what this speaks to, Nigeria, is that when people get power, there's something in our human psychology that when we get power, we just be tripping and bug out. So you have to be very mindful about that. If you're a police officer, if you're a prison guard, anytime you get authority over people, again, you need to be mindful, like, okay, look, let me not abuse my power. Let me just try and do my job effectively. But unfortunately, there's a lot in human beings that makes us kind of like, behave very nastily. And the Stanford prison experiment really, showcased that. That type of experiment is illegal now. Like, so if I wanted to do that to y'all, like I legally couldn't do it because we understand the effects it can have on people. But yeah, it was pretty messed up. Like, again, if you get time, like I think you might find that interesting. And if you hadn't heard about it yet, I'm sure that you will again. But more than likely, I probably have heard about it in some form. All right, so let's look at the things you will be tested on very specifically. And again, keep in mind, Nigeria, we started off reading this. And one of the things I want y'all to see, that we read this together. It felt like, again, we had to go over some of it a couple of times. But by the end of class, I felt like we had a good understanding of it. And I want you all to see how that makes the lecture here, like we can have a discussion as opposed to you just trying to like keep up and take all the notes. I want you to take notes, but I really want you to listen and absorb the information. But a lot of this process is so much easier when you have read the information beforehand. So we talked about juvenile delinquents, or just minors who have violated the criminal law. Sometimes they have actually committed crimes, though, but just engaged in behaviors that could lead to potential criminal activity. So truancy, you in high school, and Latasia, you ain't never going, you ditching class every day. Runaways, parents don't know where you at. Or just unmanageable children, Savannah, your mama telling you need to clean the room and wash the dishes, and you trying to knuck up at her, trying to fight your mama and stuff. Unfortunately, again, I know none of y'all would be like this, but there are juveniles who have been. And if you continue this kind of behavior, the likelihood is that, you're going to do something that will lead you being institutionalized. So again, minors who violate the law, but also, again, who are incorrigible, again, in unruly behaviors that makes it difficult for the people responsible for them to manage them, teachers, parents. And it's a thin line with this, right? Like, I'm sure, you all may have gone to school. I know I did, going to school where you have security guards and things like that. I'm sure that many of us probably saw this awful video in South Carolina a few years back, where you had like the school guard like body slamming like a teenage girl down to the ground. You get this grown ass man wrestling with this little girl. It's a thin line, right? Because like when we talk about incorrigible behaviors, being mouthy, unruly should not really fall into that. Now, again, if you're trying to like fight and choke out your mom or something like that, or you're fighting teachers, or you're just behaving overly aggressive, there are some limits to it. But in that case, like there were probably 100 different ways he could have responded, in my opinion, Latasia, before he had to put his hands on her. Like as police officers, as correction officers, like you should only use physical force if somebody is threatened. So Latasia, if you go to try and fight another student, I can use force to restrain you from like, trying to like engage in that. But once I got you subdued, then I need to let you go. But you're not supposed to express force, much like we talked about with parenting, right? Again, I understand, and I am not opposed to like, if you got to like, give your child a whooping sometime, Latasia. If you have to be using physical force all the time as a parent, then something ain't right. Like you need to look at some of your other strategies and other stuff you're doing if you got to be using physical abuse all the time, because that's when it gets to be abusive. And that's where, again, like I got a whooping or two when I was a shorty, maybe more than one or two. Who can keep track? But when I got them, like, Savannah, it was done to teach me a lesson. It was done to try and change my behavior. It wasn't done to punish me. I'm mad at Kareem, so I'm going to whoop him. That's so the same thing again, right? With police officers, corrections officers, they have a very difficult and dangerous job. I get it. But force should be used in very specific ways, and particularly when you're dealing with juveniles. We began to treat juveniles as a separate category of offenders in the 1800s. Through most of human history, it was not a major distinction for like childhood and stuff like this. This is how, like, again, we at this time, it wouldn't be uncommon to have like a 10-year-old working at a factory or something like that, for example. So you have many kids working in these environments. In the 1800s, you have like, cities growing in size. As we talked about before, Latasia, that before, if you got into some trouble, you might just get sent home, like back to your parents. But now you're having, these large cities, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Detroit, St. Louis, and you have a lot of anonymous people. So it's becoming difficult to just, send him back home to his mother. You may not know who his mother is. Some of the kids is running around without any parents. You also have many waves of immigrants. And in the cities, again, you're having all types of pathologies that human beings hadn't really had to deal with in such large numbers before. You had high levels of concentrated poverty, a lot of crime, mental illness, and dilapidation. So during this time, Nigeria, children began to be viewed as unfortunate victims of this urban scene. That you're growing up in 1870s New York, you're growing up in Chicago in 1910, the environment around you is going to be very conducive for you as a child to end up getting into some criminal activity. So again, if you're like, so in this way, it's like, look outside at what's going on. How could these children not possibly get into crime? That even if you get some quote unquote good, rich, privileged kids, but you put them in this neighborhood here in Philadelphia, they're going to end up growing into being adult criminals. So the child savings movement was created, Savannah, to try and do exactly what it said, to save these children from these very dangerous environments. This led to the passage of the first juvenile court in Illinois, in Cook County, the county that hosts Chicago, that many people call Latasia Crook County, for all the many, many, many politicians that end up going to jail. But that's neither here nor there. But this is the first time, and these, again, everything that you see here, if you're not able to get it down right away, please go back and look at this lecture being recorded and posted as always. This is information that you definitely will be tested on. So make sure that you study this closely. Do not just look at it from the notes, really read it. And again, make sure you understand the processes. It's not just enough for you to know, what Paris Patrie means. And this is where, like we talked about Nigeria, where the city or the district also kind of played a parental role over your children. That if you weren't able to be responsible for them, then yes, the state had the right to intervene. The state is the parents of everybody's children. But there became a distinction between children who were neglected and those who were delinquent. We also began to create status offenses for people under age 16 in particular. Let's look more closely at the Illinois Juvenile Court Act before we move on. As always, if there are any questions, don't hesitate to let me know. So the Illinois Juvenile Court Act was a law. And it had four primary functions. First was the establishment of a separate court to deal specifically with delinquent and neglected children. It wasn't like we talked about it wasn't like a traditional informal court of law. So they also developed special procedures to develop the adjudication of juvenile matters. So where all court hearings for adults are open to the public. Juvenile hearings are not. We want to protect their identity. They have grand juries to decide whether or not to indict, to offer an indictment. For juveniles, it's called an information. You'll probably learn about that in criminal law and procedure if you haven't taken it already. A very important component, again, all of this is working off the premise that the environment, the social environment that these children are exposed to is what's creating the criminal behavior. That if we manage the environment, then that will manage the behavior. So there also were careful steps to make sure the children were kept separate from adults when they were institutionalized. As we'll talk about later in the chapter, there are conditions that allow a child to be tried as an adult or sentenced with adults. We generally want to avoid that, but some states are less eager to do so than others. By 1925, there were only 2 states in the Union that had not followed the lead of Illinois in establishing juvenile justice systems. By 1945, everybody had caught up completely. But after a while, and particularly as these juvenile centers became more populated, our understanding and application of the law began to become more and more nuanced. A lot of these systems became the subject of a lot of critical scrutiny due to the lack of constitutional rights that the juvenile defendants enjoyed. And also there was just a lot of informality about these systems in a way that obviously is not true it's usually not true of our state and federal criminal justice system. So some of these included trying children without lawyers, not having the right to confront witnesses. These are really important where, again, Latasia, if somebody accuses you of a crime, hey, Latasia stole my computer or stole a computer. Latasia has the right to know who's saying this about her. What are they basing this on? Again, in many criminal justice systems to this day, but definitely prior to the 20th century, you could just be accused of something, and if somebody powerful enough, accused you or believed it, it would stick. So Galt began to, introduce some changes in this system that allowed juveniles to have a few more rights. So there are many landmark cases and precedents that you want to familiarize yourself with. So Galt argued in 1967 is one of the more important ones. And it just, the main thing it did is it gave, not just the rights to an attorney, but other due process rights to juvenile offenders. Again, these due process rights that we enjoy as adults is one of the distinguishing features of our American criminal justice system. They also, again, give a lot more treatment where, again, sometimes people are dealing with mental health issues or other psychological challenges. So they can be subjected to either community or institutional treatment. What this speaks to, just quite simply, the vast majority of juvenile offenders are able to go back into their communities, and they may get probation. Little Johnny, don't skip school for the next year, and you'll be good. Don't engage in any more underage drinking, Savannah, and you'll be okay. So if you do, we're gonna institutionalize you where you have to, like, be in an audio home, halfway house, something like that, where you can be away from the public and get some reform habits of behavior that would allow you to, not get institutionalized again. Some other critics, again, were looking at the disparities between juvenile systems across the country. So the Juvenile Justice Standards Project attempted to bring more uniformity to the standards of a juvenile center, where if you're in Illinois, you might be treated one way. If you're in Missouri, you might be treated another. You may have certain protections in Louisiana that you did not enjoy in California. In a couple of moments, we're going to be logged out of this particular course link. We'll log back in using the same link. We'll log back in at 2:50. That's we'll get bumped out in a couple of minutes. We still got a couple minutes to go, but once we end this session, we will log back in at 2:50 sharp. So we'll close this session by looking at blended sentences. We talked about in the first half of the class some of the different sentences that were allowed towards adult inmates, particularly when we began talking about determinate, indeterminate sentences, etc. So there are various categories of this when we're discussing juvenile offenders. So an exclusive blended sentence allows the judge to impose either a juvenile or an adult sanction and makes it effective immediately. And this would be like, where if you commit a crime when you're 17, and maybe your sentence might extend into, you becoming an adult. An exclusive blended sentencing model is where you may impose both a juvenile and an adult section, with the latter usually remaining suspended and becoming effective only in the event of a subsequent violation. So you may be sentenced to 2 years of institutionalization and then 3 years of probation if you're 16. So we're going to institutionalize you for your last 2 years of your juvenile life. You get probation as an adult, you won't have to be institutionalized, using this example, unless you violate the conditions of the probation. And again, the author gives a lot of good examples and a deeper breakdown on this as well. So check this out, please, in your reading. Then finally, it's a contiguous blended sentencing law. Where you start off in juvenile, this might be like, if you commit, like if you're 15, you commit a rape. You're not going to be allowed back into the community, for such a crime. But 3 years may not be enough. So you may get sentenced, you may get sentenced to 10 years, 3 years that you can spend within a juvenile facility, and then the remaining 7, you will be transferred to an adult facility once you become 18. I'll leave this up for you all for another few seconds until we get bumped out. We will log back in at 2:50. And for full attendance, we need to be visible throughout the class in the way that Savannah is, and the way that we've discussed since January. I'll see you all shortly.